Welcome to another episode of Underground Strategy Podcast. And we welcome back a good friend of ours, Evert. He's also been on with us before. For those, Evert, that don't know you, or for those that need a bit of reminding, please let us know what you do.
Thank you, Tony and Max, for the opportunity. So I'm a professor at the Department of Military History at Stellenbosch University. I'm a former officer that served in the South African National Defence Force. I was an armour officer. Then I also worked as a military historian at the Department of Defence Archives. I was, for a brief period, a civilian at Northwest University, where I was the head of the archives. And then I found my way back into the Department of Defense as a civilian, as a lecturer at the Military Academy, and now I lecture military history to undergraduate and postgraduate students.
Great to have you back, Evert. And last time we spoke, we covered a bit of everything, but we also touched on South Africa's naval war during the Second World War. And I know a lot of listeners wanted to hear more about that. So how did it happen that you started researching this quite specific topic?
Max, yeah, thanks. The first episode was a bit of a mixed bag because we did cover quite a bit of ground. So I think we need to start back in about 2012 or somewhere there. When I worked at the military archive, I was doing research and I happened to just open a box and there was a big file marked Operation Eisbär in German, Polar Bear in English. And my interest was already sparked. And then I started sort of digging around, and there was a lot of files on either end detailing the German U-boat campaigns in South African waters during the Second World War. So initially, I worked on just an article, and there's really great material that we'll talk a bit about later as well. But later on, a couple of years later, it became the topic of my doctorate, and I broadly looked at the naval war in South African waters. And I had a couple of markers that I sort of identified that I would want to investigate and that we will also talk about in this podcast. So firstly, what was the strategic importance of South African waters? Okay, so like what made it tick and why? Why were the Allies interested in protecting these waters around South Africa's coast? And then why would the Axis also consider launching operations so distant from Germany, from the U-boat pens in France? And also even some of the Japanese submarines that operated out of the Pacific. So that was sort of where I wanted to go. I also wanted to look at, what were the coastal defenses in place in South Africa, and then discuss the operations of the Axis raiders and submarines. And then what we talked about last time, and that we may talk about again in the future, I talked about the intelligence, the naval intelligence aspect thereof, and of course, how was intelligence collected and what was the idea behind it, and could it influence naval operations? And then finally, I sort of looked at the anti-submarine warfare because it was actually quite successful in South African waters as well. So that's sort of what I set off to do very broadly. It was a great journey. Like, well, I don't know if it's a great journey, but any PhD has its ups and downs. But I was thankful to be able to put in a lot of effort and focus just for a couple of years and just focus all of my attention on this. So I have an unhealthy knowledge of a very obscure period of Second World War history.
We like that. It's one of those topics that barely gets talked about, especially up in Europe, where most people have never even heard about the submarine war off South Africa's coast in the Second World War context. And the way you just stumbled onto it in an archive, it's a pretty exciting way to start your research and probably made it an easy choice.
Yeah, cheers.
What I think is also, on that point, how it comes together is interesting, because you mentioned strategically the Cape of Good Hope being important in terms of supply, material and all that. And that's an interesting point, Evert. And there's continuities in some ways. If we look back from, let's say, the end of the Second World War, or during that period, 150 years before that, or whatever, into Napoleonic times, it was pretty similar.
Yeah.
That there was a need to protect the Cape of Good Hope, or to occupy it as a strategic point. And when you bring it into submarines, Churchill, I think, said something similar. The one thing that gives me the fear, I'm paraphrasing, of course, one thing that gives me the fear in this war are submarines. I'm just thinking about that and some continuities, if you know what I mean, Evert, in how we see it today.
No, absolutely. So I think what makes South African waters interesting today still is that instability elsewhere, whether it's in Europe or in the Mediterranean or even further afield, could influence the strategic importance of South African waters at any given time. So, for example, if the Suez Canal is closed or Straits of Gibraltar, for whatever reason, or if there's maritime insecurity off the Horn of Africa with piracy or the Houthis or whatever, shipping can be directed around the coast of South Africa. And of course, that complicates matters drastically just for the host country, for South Africa, because all of a sudden you'll have hundreds of vessels passing through your water. You've got to provide for their safety and security and safe passage. And of course, that is what happened in the Second World War. And that was sort of where I was trying to get or establish why were these waters so important. And of course, for South Africa, the two big markers with that was the Italian entry into the war in 1940, June. And then, of course, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So that drastically altered all maritime communications across the globe. The closing of the Straits, the Suez Canal, and of course the Straits of Gibraltar, immediately anything that had to move from either Britain, or Europe, or North America to the Middle East, the Far East, wherever, had to come around the coast of South Africa. So from mid-1940, it becomes very important. And of course, the South Africans, they also provided a lot of minerals, resources. There was a big production capacity within South Africa that needed to be shipped out. So you can track it in the statistics to see how, the tonnage that passed around our coast, where were the peak periods and what happened. So that's sort of what I set out to do. And of course, as we mentioned, it was also about the movement, as you said, Tony, about the movement of troops, of equipment. I mean, if you're moving them from one side of the world to the other side, somewhere they've got to stop. And Cape Town and Durban particularly were those two big centers. And then you would have to escort those vessels, etc. So strategically speaking, South African waters were very important for the Allied war effort. I think it ties into what Max was saying as well before. It's an underappreciated importance in the broader Second World War, because it's a forgotten about aspect. Or in the broader war effort, it doesn't really feature that much. The Battle of the Atlantic and everything receives primacy, but South Africa played quite an important role, and I think the Germans tried to, or the Axis at least, tried to capitalize on this importance by launching these diversionary attacks in very far-flung waters, the waters of Cape Town, the waters of the east coast of South Africa, because they knew that there was a lot of vessels, there was a lot of tonnage moving around this coast. So if you could throw that into chaos and confusion, you could deal the Allied war effort quite a blow. So yeah, that's the strategic importance, according to me.
Yeah, no, it comes through, and like you said, we're having this conversation in two spaces, like sort of the contemporary importance, which echoes what happened then.
Yeah,
and like you mentioned, with the closing of the Suez by accident a few years back, and then also with the Yemeni attacks or the Houthi rebels there.
Yeah,
and everyone was diverted. So it just really does echo that continuity, that it is important.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, it was important, and that kind of strategic depth to the war effort. It is underrepresented, to Max's point and to yours.
Yeah.
In your book brings that out. We're going to add it into the show notes for sure. But can you build on that strategic importance and how South Africa considered coastal defenses?
So yes, I think the story starts sort of in the mid-1930s when the Union Defence Force started undergoing a process of reorganization, modernization under the then Minister of Defence, Oswald Pirow. And while the army was neglected to a large extent, the Navy, in a certain way, and the Air Force benefited immensely. And the Navy, well, broadly speaking, in terms of coastal defenses, really benefited. So from about 1939 onwards to about 42, you really see big developments in terms of coastal defenses, and a lot of fortress defense schemes being established all along the coast, principally around Cape Town, even around Durban, but even extending up to where I am located today, into Saldanha. And, it's tangible. You can still see it. It's around. So these coastal defenses were created to ward off or to repel any big enemy attack by enemy battleships. That was what they considered in terms of the threat perceptions. The irony, of course, being that there was never any such action in the waters of Cape Town, not by enemy battleships at least. So these big heavy batteries that were supposed to engage the likes of the Tirpitz or whatever, the big German naval vessels, it never materialized. So one can probably tongue-in-cheek argue that it was an overinvestment, but, they didn't know what to expect. So they went all out, and with British help, they couldn't do it by themselves. It was largely through the good graces of the British government that they were able to do so. So, yes, good coastal defenses. Well, they were not really that well established to ward off submarine attacks, for example. But nevertheless, they were there, and perhaps they had some deterrent value. I think it's debatable.
Even if it was a bit of an overreaction from South Africa, with the UK backing them up, at least they were trying to prepare for what they thought was coming. But that was mostly on land. And yeah, we talked about coastal defenses, but on the maritime side, when it came to vessels, submarines, and all of that, were they just as prepared?
It's a good question. Thanks, Max. So no, the South African Navy, it was called the Seaward Defence Force, and then later on it was called the South African Naval Forces, but negligible. I mean, it's not a pretty picture. By the start of the Second World War, there's not much. There's a conversion of a number of fishing trawlers to become mine hunters and minesweepers, but I mean, to face a naval threat head on, not much. So the South Africans really piggybacked on the good graces and the deployment of the Royal Navy. Later on in the war, the South Atlantic Station, which was one of the big Royal Naval commands, actually relocated to Cape. But yes, it was by far and large the presence of Royal Naval vessels that helped secure South African waters. The South African vessels were there and they were supporting, but without the British, we couldn't do it at all.
You've got a massive coastline, so I'm honestly a bit surprised by that. But I guess building up a maritime capacity takes serious investment and time.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the access side of things, what kind of forces actually made it all the way down to South Africa? Were we talking about submarines, surface vessels, or both?
Very broadly speaking, I think one can divide it into sort of three neat packages. Firstly, what I'll talk about is the German surface raiders that operated in the early part of the war. And then secondly, I'll speak briefly about the Japanese submarines. And then finally, I'll speak about the German submarines. So I think to start with, the first attacks that happened was these German surface raiders that were dispatched right at the beginning of the war. And their job was to go into distant waters and try and to disrupt enemy trade through false flags, imitating other vessels, whatever. And some of those German surface raiders operated as far south as Cape Town, and they mined some critical junctures, for example, off the coast of, the southern points of Africa at Cape Agulhas. They laid a successful minefield, and there were some others that were also mined, some other minefields that were established around the coast. And there were some opportunistic attacks by these raiders, but not enough to throw shipping into disarray. It was opportunistic, but I think the Germans were also, they were using this to sort of test the waters, proverbially speaking, to see, would far-flung operations be, if you had a sustained operation, would it be feasible? And on occasion, there was a couple of German U-boats that traversed the waters, but it wasn't dedicated operations. They sunk some shipping, but nothing crazy. And there was also, perhaps just to mention, there was the odd Italian submarine that also came down the coast from East Africa, but also nothing really worth writing home about. The first big threat, and I think here the South Africans, the threat perception was sort of split in two. They had to contend for attacks that could happen on the Atlantic coast, the west coast of South Africa, and they had to also consider the east coast, the Indian Ocean. So for the Atlantic coast, they considered German surface raiders and submarines. That was what they prepared for, and they knew that they were operating on long distances, and the chance of big operations happening was not really considered. On the Indian Ocean coast, it was okay. The Italians had been part of the war since 1940, but when Japan entered the war 1941, December, of course, that changed everything. And early 1942, with the Japanese advances into East Asia and the capturing of strategic naval bases, it, of course, altered the situation. So now the focus was really on what the naval threat, how that was going to change. And we see that in June and July 1942, after the Germans and the Japanese had agreed on a line that would demarcate their operations, the Japanese launched a limited submarine offensive in the Mozambique Channel, so between Mozambique and Madagascar, where a lot of the shipping that then traveled up the coast from Durban up to either, the Middle East or to the Far East or to India, where it had to travel through. So within the space of about 2 months, the Japanese really threw shipping in the Mozambican coast into chaos. And the Japanese attacks were actually, even though they were quite successful, they were diversionary. So whilst the attention of the South Africans was now focused on the East Coast, the Germans in the meanwhile had now started launching sustained submarine operations at the Cape of Good Hope. So we see in October 1942, with Operation Eisbar that I've mentioned before, where the Germans now strike quickly, sharp, fast, and unexpected, and they launched the submarine campaign in South African waters. And the South Africans did not expect it. I mean, the lighthouses were still fully functioning. There was no blackout procedures. There are great photos that some of these German U-boat commanders took through their periscopes of Table Bay being lit up, with the lights at night that they took through their periscopes. So the success of this German submarine operation leads to another two or three at least another two, and then some odds going into 1942. But so from October 1942 until August 1943, we see a number of German U-boats now being dispatched to South African waters and being very successful. I speak under correction, so don't shoot me if I get the amount wrong, but let's say there was an excess of 150 vessels sunk during this period by the German submarines, or the Axis submarines for that matter. So in a short space of time, quite a lot of successes. By about August 1943, we see that the German submarine operations start declining, but they still operate in the waters until about 1944. So yeah, in a nutshell, three big not big, but three different episodes that one can sort of divide the Axis naval operations into.
Just a quick question. I started to think about logistics, and we're not talking about short distances here. How did both submarines and surface vessels handle these long trips? Did they have to make the whole journey down the African coast without resupplying, or was there some kind of logistics setup?
Very good question. Yeah, no, great question as always, Max. So the surface raiders, I think, was a bit different. They could operate for longer periods of time. They could also capture enemy vessels and, take fuel, oil, or whatever. But the submarines, especially the earlier German submarines, they were operating on the limits of their operational capability if they came down to the waters of Cape Town. So your operational capacity would be very limited. So what the Germans established, they had a number of secret rendezvous points, and in the South Atlantic, the name escapes me now. I think it was called Andalusian or something, one of the secret rendezvous points, where a German supply U-boat called Milk Cows would rendezvous with the Wolfpack, and then they would take on fuel oil, diesel, lubricants, torpedoes, food, whatever they needed, they could take on. And operating from there with those provisions, it would give them a time on target around the South African coast of, I think it's approximately 30 days, maybe a little bit less, but sort of in that range. And then on the way back, they could refuel again and then sort of go back to Lorient or wherever they were operating from in France. So they definitely needed these supply vessels, and so there were ones operating in the Atlantic Ocean, but there were also similar ones operating in the Indian Ocean. And of course, the German submarines could go as far as Penang in the Indian Ocean, where some of the big Japanese bases were, where they could get supplies from as well.
All right, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it.
It really is fascinating, Evert, when you think about the footprint that must have left and also the planning to put that all in place. It's just, we sometimes lose sight of the scale of the Second World War and, just so many aspects. And coming back to your point about understudied, right?
Yeah.
And I want to touch on the naval element, the maritime elements, in popular imaginations, always linked to signal intelligence, Enigma. And of course, behind that's always the human intelligence. They have to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
You'll know more, Max will know more. But tell us from the South African side, how did this naval intelligence piece tie in, overall? It might be on land or at sea or a bit of both.
Absolutely. I mean, it was similar to the coastal defenses. The South Africans really piggybacked on the Royal Navy. And in the Royal Navy, the Y organization, the signals intelligence was principal in intercepting the communications of these U-boats, because, of course, they would have to surface once a day or twice a day to either make contact back to German Naval Command or to receive orders or whatever. So through direction finding or radio direction finding, they would then try to pinpoint where these submarines were operating from. If they could copy the messages, then they could send it to Bletchley Park in the UK to be deciphered and read. Okay, so then they would be able to sort of try and figure out what was what, and with the breaking of the Enigma code, read some of these messages later on. So, yeah, the Royal Navy was very important. And of course, as mentioned in the earlier episode, they were also very paramount in picking up the illicit transmissions in South Africa from the German spies or the German intelligence networks, and also the South African movement, the Oswald Brandwacht, that was aiding and abetting the German intelligence networks. And the collation of all of that gave the Allies, the British in particular, quite a big picture of what was happening. They also picked up that the Oswald Brandwacht actually wanted to make direct contact with the German U-boats operating in South African waters, because they felt that they could pass on real-time intelligence to them. But Dönitz and the German Naval High Command was not keen on a couple of Afrikaans boys communicating directly with the German submarines. So yes, signals intelligence was very important. And when we talk about the anti-submarine warfare, of course, the signals intelligence becomes very important to try and plan or pinpoint the position of submarines and then plan offensive operations to interdict them.
I honestly had no idea until you mentioned it just now how much of a dent they actually made in shipping down there. Maybe not on an Atlantic level, but still, it's significant. So what kind of approach did the South Africans and their allies take to deal with these submarines?
So as we've mentioned before, the coastal defenses were obviously geared towards deterrence and dealing with large-scale enemy battleships, but dealing with the submarine threat was very different. So for the South Africans, it was very interesting. So when the operations or when the attack started in October 1942, I would argue that the South Africans were entirely ill-prepared to deal with this. They were basically caught off guard, and they only activated their anti-submarine measures when the first attacks happened. So they were reactive. They were just reactive. They were not prepared for this at all. So the initial, it took a slow time for them to activate all the measures to, like I mentioned before, the cities were still brightly lit up. There was no blackouts enforced. So those types of measures had to be implemented quite quickly, because the war had been distant. And the war was in many regards distant, but the submarine attacks or the U-boat attacks brought the war home to the South Africans. At least, they could see ships going up in flames and they could read about it in the papers. This was real. But what was interesting was that despite the fact that the South Africans were quite slow in responding to this, or along with the British, within the first 20 or 24 to 48 hours, they managed to sink a German submarine. One could probably argue by chance it was a British destroyer that sunk it. But off the coast of Cape Town, for Tony would know what I'm talking about, sort of just north of Cape Town, between Robben Island and Dustin Island off the coast of Eiserfontein, they managed to sink a German U-boat. So, hey, it's lying there. I don't know exactly where, but it's lying somewhere there. It's still lying there. Because there are these valuable accounts of the other German U-boat captains where they could hear on the ASDEC what was happening. And, they could hear that one of their U-boats were being depth charged. And it was sunk. So systematically, the South Africans, along with the British, started clawing their way back and trying to get control over the situation. And once the anti-submarine measures were really activated and ramped up, it became very difficult for the U-boats to operate, because anti-submarine patrols were now taking place, both in the air and on the surface. ships were forced to sail on convoy with escorts, okay, so making it more difficult to attack. Of course, not impossible to attack because you also got a nice big juicy target when everything's traveling together. So those type of measures were enforced for ships or vessels traveling up the coast along the Indian Ocean and also around the Atlantic coast until they got to dispersal points where they would then either disperse or they would still continue on in bigger convoys, depending on what they were now. But from October 1942 until about 1944, there was 3 submarines sunk in South African waters. Okay, the one in October 1942, one in, I think it was August 1943, sort of northeast of South Africa, closer to Madagascar. And then there was one sunk in March 1944. And that's actually quite nice because it marks the beginning of the submarine campaign, the middle sort of height of it, and then the end of it. And by the end of the German U-boat operations, South African waters were basically secured. The tide of the war, of course, had changed, but the South Africans were able to launch a number of combined operations. And if you interrogate the war diaries of the South Atlantic Station of the Royal Navy, there's some very interesting stats because you can pick up how many times a month they've picked up U-boats or spotted U-boats or interdicted U-boats, not always successfully, but they've picked them up. So, of course, combined operations on land, for what it was worth, the Air Force, and of course then the Navy, I mean interchangeably South African and British units. So the final operation where they managed to sink successfully a German U-boat was called Operation Wicketkeeper. Okay, like cricket references, but it was quite a distance of the South African coast, hundreds of miles. But they managed to, through signals intelligence and whatever, at the combined operations room, pinpoint the location from where the submarine had transmitted, and then they managed to sort of track it and also determine where they should have their search focused. And they managed to find it, and with a couple of Catalinas, they managed to bomb it, strafe it. It fought back. These Germans didn't go down without a fight, but that was a success. So if any of the listeners ever want to delve deeper into it, I think the anti-submarine war is very interesting because we have those 3 successful sinkings. It's also nice to sort of see what was the case when it started, what was happening in the middle, and how it had progressed by the end of the war.
My main takeaway from what you've just said, which is brilliant, and I do hope one day we'll be able to do a salvage operation with underground strategy.
Yes.
Yourself at Department of Military History.
Max can dive.
Exactly. I'm having a coffee on the ship or on the coast, But yeah, we definitely need to do that in on the west coast of South Africa.
As a joker, I can throw in a not that well-known fact about myself. I don't know if you knew that I did my commercial diving training in the muddy waters of Durban.
No, I didn't. But you are then perfectly fit for task. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit off topic, but since we're talking about diving, I'm actually Class 2 certified wet bell diver. Did my training in Durban back in 2008 for the old Sea Dog Grant Jameson, if you know who that is. So yeah, I'm definitely all set for this mission.
And Durban's never been the same, I guess.
Definitely not. South Africa was not prepared for a Swede running amok along the Golden Mile.
And for our listeners, now you guys know Max is a bit of a show-off, but that's why we love him. I did my snorkeling course, in Hermanus I think in 1989. When I was
good.
I'm not kidding, of course. I was just a kid, like swimming doggy paddle. No, I also want to clarify for our listeners that the wicketkeeper that Evert mentioned, the cricket reference for those that don't watch cricket, is something like the catcher in baseball. So someone that's behind and does all the catching. We have touched on cricket before, where Max was putting out some fighting words about cricket not being understandable to anyone. But yeah, it's a hell of a thing, all that you've mentioned, off the coast there, Evert, and just to, coming to the end of it now, were there any lessons learned? Because you're looking at the long view, it's a bit of a complicated one for South Africa. You had mentioned some stuff earlier about, you go back to the First World War, it was basically all UK at that point, right? Like, I mean, someone will correct me, but you know what I mean. And then was anything learned from this? Any lessons that were taken?
Look, I think, it's probably open for speculation. It would be interesting to sort of figure out what's being presented at the Naval Staff College in South Africa. If when they deal with naval history, if this ever features, who knows? I think the lessons from the Second World War is still very topical. South African waters are still important, maybe less so, but in the event of future conflicts, we could find ourselves in a situation where the importance of South African waters are again of prime importance for whoever. And then one has to ask the question, would South Africa be able to handle such an amount of traffic? Our ports, our harbors, can they do it? And of course, most importantly, can we provide for the security and the safe passage of those vessels with a Navy who is, for many different reasons, struggling? And will they be able to do that? And let's say, worst case scenario, there's submarine attacks in South African waters. Do we have the capability of launching dedicated anti-submarine operations? And do we have necessarily the allies to back us up to be able to do it? Like in the Second World War, where the British played such an important role in South Africa's coastal defense and in the naval war that was waged off of our waters. So I think there's a lot of speculation and things that we can talk about, but I don't think we should forget the past for convenience sake. I think it's still relevant today in the 21st century. It's something that our future naval officers and naval staff officers should really get stuck into.
And I think recent events have shown that, we touched on it earlier, what's happened in Yemen and how shipping was diverted through the Horn of Africa, the east coast of Africa, Cape of Good Hope, Durban, Cape Town, and then up, through the Atlantic and vice versa, right? So it's still there. The discussion is still there. I think it's maybe something, Max, that we need to touch on in the future, right? Like something to do with the geostrategy of, shipping, because let's be honest, flight's important, air power is important, but the mass, in terms of projection of power, it's still by sea, right?
Yes, 100%. And I think that is something people tend to overlook. Everyone talks about air power and land campaigns, but the good old sea has always been just as critical, in my opinion, both in wartime and in peacetime. It's, of course, not as flashy, but without control of the oceans, nothing moves. So we definitely need to touch on this more. And I'll be honest, I'm a bit of a closet Navy guy, so I'm going to enjoy this one.
No one's perfect. I mean, but we've had Hicks on before, Evert, so
Cool.
we'll bring the whole family together, I think, for that episode.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it.
Just before we close, Evert, do you have any final thoughts or anything that you want to mention about your book, about the research or the process that perhaps you didn't mention? You started off with something like Out of a Dream Job, like some sort of Dan Brown book. I stumbled into the archives one day at work and, opened a document, and then from there a PhD unfolded over years of work, and then a full research project. So for me, it sounds tremendous, but anything more that you want to mention to us that perhaps we didn't get into on the book?
No, I think, look, the Naval War in South African waters is quite a rare book, maybe because it was more of an academic book and not many copies were printed. A couple of weeks ago, I actually met somebody that had a copy, and I was like, wow, hallelujah, somebody bought the book. But I think it's, without punting it too hard, I think it's an interesting part of our Second World War history. But I think the main takeaway would be that South Africa's Second World War history is important. I don't think it necessarily gets the recognition it deserves for many different reasons, previously, politically, whatever. But there's a young crop of historians, if I dare call myself young still, but anyway, there's some younger than me that are contributing and trying their best, and tackling some interesting topics. So hopefully you guys can have some of them on board in the future. And I think watch this space in the next 15 years or so in the run-up to the Second World War's centenary. I think we're in for an interesting time, and hopefully we can claw back our way into the more general historiography on the Second World War.
That sounds absolutely fantastic, Evert. And if you can still call yourself young, then so can I. So let's just keep that going. Always great having you on, and yet again another masterclass on South Africa's naval war during the Second World War. And I think with the centenary coming up, I think more people will start recognizing just how important this history is. And I'm sure we'll have plenty more to dig into. Looking forward to have you back. And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.